I'm actually speaking with you today from the basement study of my home in Council Bluffs, which is located in another beautiful and fragile range of prairie hills, the Loess Hills of western Iowa. My wife and I have lived here for 23 years now and raised our 3 sons. Some of you may be familiar with the Loess Hills, but just in case, a little history. They were created during the last retreat of the glaciers from the region, during which hurricane force winds lifted up the pulverized soil known as loess, which is German for loose, and began depositing it on the eastern edge of the Missouri River. They are 200 to 300 feet high and run from the southeast point of South Dakota down the entire western edge of Iowa and just into Missouri. And if you've ever traveled on Interstate 29 in this area, you have no doubt noticed them on the east side there of the river to the highway. The only other place that has loess drifts of this dramatic depth is China along the Yellow River, but those have been significantly altered. So the Iowa Loess Hills may be the last of their kind in the world. Ecologically, they are incredibly important, providing refuge for the majority of what remains of Iowa's native prairie habitats. That fact takes on even more significance when one realizes that less than 1/10 of 1% of Iowa's overall native habitats remain, which is the worst percentage in the Union. For human communities, the Loess Hills have also been very special. The Iowa people have long considered them sacred, and their traditions speak of the appearance of a sun bridge across which their dead loved ones pass into the West. My own family pioneered in this area of the state, though not in the hills themselves. Even so, my children represent the 7th generation in my family to reside in western Iowa. So this place is very personal to me, which is reflected in my 3 published memoirs, with a 4th on the way in the spring, and from the University of Iowa Press, which I'm happy about, and the nature writing anthology I edited, the Tallgrass Prairie Reader. My personal and family history, the ways they have intersected with the history of the hills, the prairies, and the cycles of wildlife moving through them, including migrating birds, have been the subject of and/or inspiration for almost everything I have written. Summarized in this way, that personal connection to the prairies of my home may seem somewhat inevitable, but nothing could be further from the truth. Although I grew up just a few hours from here, I had very little appreciation for the prairie and no consciousness of, let alone appreciation for, these remarkable hills. This ignorance lasted well into graduate school at the University of Iowa and into my early years actually as a writer. In fact, I was recently trying to locate the first time I mentioned the Loess Hills in an essay of mine and discovered that it was in a piece published in 1997 when I was 31 years old, so that late. And here's the quote. "We drove through Denison, Iowa, where my father spent his childhood, and on to the soft slopes along the edge of the Missouri River Valley." That's it. Soft slopes. I didn't even know enough to call them by name. So my journey from there to here, from indifference toward prairie places to love and personal commitment, was pretty unlikely, and perhaps many of you might describe the history of your own love affair with the nature of this region in a similar way. Your journey, like mine, may have also had its ups and downs, its joys and disappointments, its moments of great hope and great doubt. We sometimes, I think, lack confidence in the urgency of our personal stories about place, neglecting to write them down and share them with others. But given the significant threats that are facing the prairie today and other places as well, I strongly believe those personal stories can become an essential act of witness, linked with all the other acts of witness that have come before us, offered in defense of human and ecological communities facing catastrophic losses or even extinction. Think John Muir in the Sierras, or Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, or Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. And more recently, Scott Russell Sanders, who, in confronting the damming of his home river in Ohio and the flooding of his family's land, writes, "If enough people had spoken for the river, we might have saved it. If enough people had believed that our scarred country was worth defending, we might have dug in our heels and fought. Our attachments to the land were all private. We had no shared lore, no literature, no art to root us there, to give us courage, to help us stand our ground. The only maps we had were those issued by the state, showing a maze of numbered lines stretched over emptiness. The Ohio landscape never showed up on postcards or posters, never unfurled like tapestry in films, rarely filled even a paragraph in books. There were no mountains in that place, no waterfalls, no rocky gorges, no vistas. It was a country of low hills, cut over woods, scoured fields, villages that had lost their purpose, roads that had lost their way. This ground was lost. The flood would reclaim it. But other ground could be saved, must be saved, in every watershed, every neighborhood. For each home ground, we need new maps, living maps, stories and poems, photographs and paintings, essays and songs. We need to know where we are so that we may dwell in our place with a full heart. This need to contribute to a shared lore, a living map of the prairie, was one of my biggest inspirations for putting together the Tallgrass Prairie Reader, which was published by the University of Iowa Press in 2015, which gathers together voices ranging from the 1600s to the present that give witness, often in very personal terms, to the beauty, power, and ongoing significance of the Tallgrass Prairies. These include some well-known voices like John Muir, Zikala Issa, and Aldo Leopold, among others. I believe, and there are some, though, that I believe deserve more attention and took a while to find. For example, Kansas minister and author William Quayle. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he wrote in 1905, "You must not be in the prairie, but the prairie must be in you." I love this quote for a lot of reasons. One of them being that I believe this personal inner realm remains one of the major fronts in our efforts to restore and preserve what remains of the prairie. That has been a particularly difficult challenge here in the Midwest. As contemporary environmental historian Dan Flores has commented, the citizens of prairie states, quote, "are today among the most divorced of all Americans from any kind of connection with regional nature," end quote. My own experience growing up in Iowa supports his claim. In fact, I cannot recall one person from my peer group who knew or even cared much about tallgrass ecosystems, including me. And I still encounter students in my classes at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where I teach literature and creative nonfiction writing. I have students there who have grown up in the area but never visited the Loess Hills or any other local prairie sites, not unlike my high school self and college age self. Thankfully, there have been a lot of immensely positive developments in prairie education and awareness in the years since I was in school, but there is certainly more work to do. We need to continue disseminating scientific knowledge about the prairies among our citizens, especially young people, which I know many of you are engaged in doing. However, I believe that for many of those citizens, especially the ones who share my earlier indifference, it will require a corresponding increase in feelings for and imaginative engagement with prairie ecosystems, an increase in knowing and caring. For models of that emotional connection, that caring, it might seem reasonable to turn to the long tradition of American nature writing. What I discovered in my initial research, however, was that even as a literary landscape, the tallgrass prairies are in danger. Since the time of Thoreau and Muir, the American environmental imagination has remained largely focused on the forests and mountains, oceans, and deserts. We're a biome that once covered 40% of the United States, and one that on other continents played a significant role in our evolution as a species. We're lucky if writing about grasslands of any kind occupies a small percentage of the pages in nature magazines and anthologies. And among those limited pages, tallgrass prairie literature occupies an even smaller space. In the 2002 college edition of the Norton Book of Nature Writing, for example, Out of the 157 pieces listed in the table of contents, ranging from 1789 to 1999, there are only 16 focused on world grasslands, and sometimes only marginally. Of those, 5 authors write of North American tallgrass country, and again, sometimes only marginally. This literary version of prairie emptiness has added to the challenge faced by those currently working to restore and preserve these ecosystems and trying to recruit others to the cause. I fear the unspoken message to young environmentalists, including writers and scholars and scientists, is that the most urgent battles for the health of our planet are to be found elsewhere, the prairies being either beyond hope or not worthy of consideration. If nature writer Annie Dillard is right that seeing is in part a matter of articulation of language, the relative absence of prairie literature and writers in the American nature canon is in this sense a form of collective blindness, but it is even more than that. It is another kind of extinction. Still, like the postage stamp prairies that provide seed for restorations, the literature of the tallgrass is out there and it matters. It certainly mattered to me and played an essential role in my own awakening to the prairies as a writer and lifelong citizen of this region. This was another motivation for creating the Tallgrass Prairie Reader, to research and assemble first-person nonfiction that together tell one story out of many of the impact of the tallgrass environment on the thoughts, emotions, and actions of individuals who have encountered it over the course of 5 centuries. People for whom the prairie was, among all its other characteristics, a personal force. This is particularly evident in early descriptions of prairie fires. One of my favorite is by George Catlin, a writer and painter who in the 1830s explored the prairies of the upper Mississippi and Missouri rivers. While encamped near Fort Leavenworth in northeastern Kansas, he wrote, "The prairies burning form some of the most beautiful scenes that are to be witnessed in this country, and also some of the most sublime. Over the elevated lands and prairie bluffs, where the grass is thin and short, the fire slowly creeps with a feeble flame, which one can easily step over. The scenes at night become indescribably beautiful when their flames are seen at many miles' distance, creeping over the sides and tops of the bluffs, appearing to be sparkling and brilliant chains of liquid fire, the hills being lost to the view, hanging suspended in graceful festoons from the skies. But there is yet another character of burning prairies that requires a different pen to describe, the war or hell of fires, where the grass is 7 or 8 feet high, as is often the case for many miles together on the Missouri bottoms, and the flames are driven forward by the hurricanes, which often sweep over the vast prairies of this denuded country. The fire in these, before such a wind, travels at an immense and frightful rate." Catlin goes on to describe how his group was nearly overwhelmed by a prairie fire. Representations of prairie fires in literature and paintings were immensely popular during Catlin's time. As art historian Joni Kinsey observes, Catlin and the artists that followed him often used, quote, events such as fire to carry dramatic narrative. But I'd like to think it was a little deeper than that. Together, these 19th century artists and writers offered the public a vicarious connection to what Walt Whitman called America's characteristic landscape, a place unlike any they had ever seen or imagined, a genuine wilderness, which is to say a place of danger and death, as well as sublime beauty, where human ambitions could quickly be overwhelmed by natural forces. There were also a number of softer treatments of prairie beauty in literature at the time. Eliza Woodson Farnham, for instance, wrote this in Life in Prairie Land, her 1846 account of farm life in Illinois. "Spring morning on the prairies. I wish I could find the language that would convey to the mind of the reader an adequate idea of the deep joy which the soul drinks in from every feature of this wonderful scene. If you could stand where I have often stood, when the rosy clouds were piled against the eastern sky, and the soft tremulous light was streaming aslant the dewy grass, while not a sound of life broke on the ear, save the wild note of the prairie chicken, so much in harmony with the whole of visible nature. He would feel one of the charms which bind the hearts of the sons and daughters of this land. And in one of the more spiritual engagements, here again is Kansan William Quayle. This is a great, strange presence, the intimation of the intimate, this feeling that your journey leads you into space, that if your feet would walk to the horizon verge, they would thereafter journey out into the sky. My opinion holds that this feeling is more visible in the prairies than seas. With the prairie, its chrysoprase is strikingly beautifully, and I will add gloriously, contrasted with the sky amethyst, so that here are two lands apparent on which the path is set. The prairie path leads to the sky path. The paths are one, the continents are two, and you make your journey from the prairies to the sky. You tramp across the chrysoprase into the amethyst. O journey from the near into the far, O journey from the swaying green into the becalmed, illimitable blue, O journey from the earth with prairie wind a-blowing in the face into the far dim spaces level as the seashore, where by imperceptible tilt of landscape I am led at last up to the purple hilltops of eternity, where blow unhindered and forever the winds of God. O journey, journey. Here as well is Dakota author Zitkala Sa in her powerful 1921 essay, The Great Spirit, writing of the prairie bluffs near her home along the Missouri River. My heart and I lie small upon the earth like a grain of throbbing sand. Drifting clouds and tinkling waters, together with the warmth of a genial summer day, bespeak with eloquence the loving mystery around us. At length retracing the uncertain footpath, scaling the precipitous embankment, I seek the level lands where grow the prairie wildflowers, and they, the lovely little folk, soothe my soul with their perfumed breath. Their quaint round faces of varied hue convince the heart which leaps with surprise that they too are living symbols of omnipotent thought. With a child's eager eye, I drink in the myriad star shapes wrought in luxuriant color upon the green. Beautiful is the spiritual essence they embody. Now, Charles Dickens, in contrast, visited Looking Glass Prairie near St. Louis in 1842 and wrote this about his experience. The effect on me was a disappointment. It is not a scene to be forgotten, but it is scarcely one, I think, to remember with much pleasure or to covet the looking on again in afterlife. Ouch. As it turned out, however, earlier literary accounts of the beauty and power of the prairie published in books sold mostly to distant readers on the coast were not enough to save the actual prairie wilderness. As biologist Daryl Smith and others have confirmed, the destruction of the majority of the original tallgrass prairies largely occurred during a 70-year period from 1830 to 1900. By the time it was possible for an environmental literary imagination to have taken root in the region to the depth of, say, John Muir in the Sierras, one of several, by the way, environmental luminaries raised in the Midwest, most of the original tallgrass wilderness was gone, as in over 90% gone. Many Midwestern authors at the time viewed this massive conversion of original prairie to cropland as inevitable. However, among those who actually witnessed the dramatic environmental change and almost unimaginable loss of life, there can also be found expressions of profound shock and even grief. The prairies are gone, wrote former Iowan Hamlin Garland in 1893, who grew up on the prairies of Wisconsin and Iowa. I held one of the ripping, snarling, breaking plows that rolled the hazel bushes and wild sunflowers under. And so there comes into my reminiscences an unmistakable note of sadness. William J. Haddock, an attorney and settler in eastern Iowa, confessed in his 1901 memoir that the passing of the prairie made him, quote, sad and depressed. He continued, I hold that whoever has not seen the prairies has not seen the grandeur and beauty of Iowa. The contemplation of greater wealth in buildings and farm products than the pioneers saw is a poor compensation. Famous author and Ohio native Sherwood Anderson, in a letter dated from the 1920s, contemplated the spiritual impact of this loss on those living in the region. This is an extended quote from him. A curious notion comes often to me. Is it not likely that when the country was new and men were often alone in the fields and forests, they got a sense of bigness outside themselves that has now in some ways been lost? I don't mean the conventional religious thing that is still prevalent and that is nowadays being retailed to the people by the most up-to-date commercial methods, but something else. Mystery whispered in the grass, played in the branches of trees overhead, was caught up and blown across the horizon line in clouds of dust at evening on the prairies. Another 30 to 50 years actually would have to pass before an activist environmental perspective emerged more generally in nonfiction literature by regional writers such as Meredith LeSueur, Otto Leopold, John Matson, Josephine W. Johnson, and Missouri farmer and environmentalist Eugene Perot, who wrote in 1964, an extended quote here, "The once great prairies with their fruit and wildlife nourished our nation through its weak infancy. They nourished it again through its reckless and wasteful adolescence. The nation has now reached a maturity which should make it capable of recognizing that the prairie can no longer give that which it does not have, and that as man destroys it, he destroys himself." Consciousness of a landscape that had been almost completely destroyed, was still being destroyed, was very much in the foreground for these authors, and also at times a haunting fatalism. While visiting a prairie remnant in a Wisconsin cemetery, Aldo Leopold remarks famously, "Few grieved when the last buffalo left Wisconsin, and few will grieve when the last silphium or compass plant follows him to the lush prairies of the Never Never Land." Naturalist John Matson, who grew up in central Iowa, writes, "My feeling for the Tallgrass Prairie is like that of a modern man who has fallen in love with the face in a faded tintype. Only the frame is still real. The rest is illusion and dream. So it is with the original prairie. The beautiful face of it had faded before I was born, before I had a chance to touch and feel it. And all that I have known of the prairie is the setting and the mood, a broad sky of pure and intense light with a sort of loftiness to the days, and the young prairie-born winds running past me from open horizons." In the decades since then, restoration and preservation, informed by hard science, have become major themes in nature writing about the prairies. Here in the early 21st century, creative writers have inherited greater knowledge of prairie ecosystems and are increasingly participating in recovery efforts on the ground, and encouraging others to do the same through their published work. Instead of writing about the prairies primarily for coastal audiences, as in previous centuries, more are writing for and speaking with those actually living in prairie places, places where they too reside. A sense of powerlessness in the face of ecological loss is being challenged, I hope, by a growing appreciation for the ways art, including personal stories, can create and nurture a deeper, more personal, and yes, spiritual correspondence between human beings and the Tallgrass Prairie. Two of my favorite contemporary examples in the anthology of that spiritual connection include Cindy Crosby's account of seed collecting on the 100-acre Schulenburg Prairie in the western suburbs of Chicago, where she is a steward supervisor. Crosby writes, "For one who loves to come to the prairie to reflect, to rest, and to find silence, these summer evenings are a cause for readjustment. I thought of the prairie as a place for solitude. Now I'm seeing it as a place for community. Together we're doing in 2 hours what it would take individual weeks to accomplish. Although some of these folks have been coming out here for years to volunteer on the prairie, for about half of us, this is out of the ordinary. Through working side by side in the mud, we're already forging a common bond, united by tall grass, charm in the singular, beauty in the aggregate. significance in the single cardinal song that pours out into the landscape, and glory in the flock of cedar waxwings, soft music as they congregate in the evenings by Willoway Brook. Without the individual, the opportunity for landscape is lost. Without the landscape, context for the individual vanishes. The dependency that I once resisted forms in my life. Now it becomes strangely alluring. Community prayer is powerful. The prayers of many form a woven net to catch us, to hold us, and to encourage us when we falter. Through the efforts of many, planting, replanting, and pulling weeds, the prairie will continue to sustain community. Another favorite passage in the anthology for me is from an essay by Turtle Mountain Chippewa author Louise Erdrich called Big Grass, which I personally consider the unofficial prayer of the prairie. She writes, "I would be converted to a religion of grass, sleep the winter away and rise headlong each spring, sink deep roots, conserve water, respect and nourish your neighbors, and never let trees gain the upper hand. Grow lush in order to be devoured or caressed, stiffen in sweet elegance, invent startling seeds, bow beneath the arm of fire, connect underground, provide, be lovely and do no harm." I hope you'll indulge me in sharing a short sample from my own personal writing. It's the ending of an essay titled "Why Geese Don't Winter in Paradise," and it was included in my collection, Man Killed by Pheasant, which was published in 2008. This essay is about the death of my grandfather, with whom I was very close. Unfortunately, he suffered from dementia during his final years, during which he spoke a lot about the adventures he had in what he called his second life, which of course had never happened. So he hadn't lost memories; he gained memories. But someone actually made the mistake at one point of calling them, this second life, these false memories, as his dreams. To which he responded angrily that he knew the difference between dream and reality. And my great aunt had told me, actually just before, the day before my grandfather passed away, that he had mentioned to her that he saw the geese flying south. And I thought, okay, that's great. But she went on to say that every year he would call her whenever he first saw the geese flying south, and he'd tell her, "I saw the geese, sister. I saw the geese, sister," which is, I guess, something that he told her when he was a little boy. They were going up in Fort Dodge, my hometown. So this was like a love of wildness that they had shared since they were young, and she told me all other stories about the walks they would take in the woods and how he knew all the trees and loved the wildlife there. All of it a big surprise for me. The week after my grandfather died, I took my students in my environmental literature class, to DeSoto National Wildlife Refuge, which maybe some of you are familiar with, up by Missouri Valley, Iowa, on the Missouri River there, in November, so this time of year, to watch the great flocks of snow geese that returned there. But by the time of the end of the day during our visit, we hadn't seen them yet. And that's when this happens. So this is where the story picks up. This is the end of the essay. "Muse not that I thus suddenly proceed. That's actually the quote that my grandfather had under his photograph in the yearbook. "Muse not that I thus suddenly proceed." But that's exactly what I do back at the DeSoto parking lot. My students have already left without seeing the big flocks. I'm ready to go myself, but have paused to admire the fiery scallops of the disappearing sun. This is the time of day when my grandfather died, holding hands with his sister. He chose, if there be such a choice, to end with her in that place, in this season. He had noticed the geese every year, had loved in his own way the cycles of the land. He still holds, the restless spirit that defined him. Even the sky, I can already see a few stars. Soon, if the evening is clear, I'll be able to spot Orion and my favorite Vega, a blue-white star much bigger than our own. Vega used to be the North Star, and it will be so again in another 12,000 years. It will guide once more the transient and the lost, including this sun, this planet, which are moving toward it. We won't arrive for hundreds of millions of years, but still, when I look at Vega through my binoculars, I think I see among all the stars a special brilliance, the fire that lights the end of our story. So it will be dark soon, but not yet. The brilliance of the day seems, in fact, to be growing, covering the sky with gold. Near the zenith, there is a smudge of shadow. It becomes larger, noisier, more irregular, and then they are above me, the snow geese, thousands of them returning from the fields, blotting out the sky just as I have always imagined and hoped they would. I'm sorry my students aren't here to see it. Will they believe me when I tell them? But I'm here and I am thankful. Thankful despite everything to be home, the way he was. I wonder if that would surprise him to know that in my memory he is forever linked with these birds, that they have become for me his life's articulation, that wherever else we might travel together, he is also here, watching the geese return to the Missouri River. I stare into their loud, shimmering depths and lose my bearings. Who is moving? Who is still? Who is alive, dead? Can anything be truly lost or forgotten? I look for the answers. They fly on, blurring as they always have, the border between fact and desire, rivers upon rivers, flowing forever. Now that, I can almost hear him say, is a dream. The epic stories of the prairie continue to be written on the page and in the earth. And I believe each of us has an opportunity to contribute to that story. I'm sure that during your weekend together there at Guevara, you will find plenty of inspiration to do so. Out there among the wetlands and prairies, knowledge can freely and irrevocably entwine with imagination, and the rituals of reading and science can become at once the rituals of body and spirit. Out there, when a person bends down to examine a prairie grass stem or a bizarre insect, or to press their fingers into the soil, touching roots, they can engage in one of the great paradoxes of human existence. The closer we are to the earth, the more we are uplifted. That is part of the mystery of the prairie, however diminished. Its ongoing power to transform both soil and soul. Two words separated by only one letter, the singular first person I, that is in all of us, seeking the happiness of which Willa Cather spoke, to become a part of something entire, to be dissolved into something complete and great. The prairies, for many of us, are that something entire. It is my sincere hope that literature, past, present, and future, will inspire more people to get outside and become part of the nearest stretch of prairie, celebrating its still magnificent wildlife, whether a flower or insect, or the great migrations of the cranes. But I also hope that reading and sharing the literature of the prairie will strengthen the feeling that you too are part of the larger, continuing story of the tall grass, no matter where you live, and that it will inspire each of you to add a new chapter to your own written personal accounts of your personal relationship with nature. What form that chapter takes will be as individual as you are, and it will likely change over time. It certainly has for me. Early in my journey as a writer, I came to believe authors and other artists had a responsibility to the earth that sustains us, and that meant we had a responsibility to prairies, that we should know them and help them and assist others in doing the same through our words, our art, our actions. I still believe that, but experience has taught me that fulfilling that responsibility requires more than righteous indignation. What is required as well is repentance, not in the sense of confessing sin and seeking forgiveness and offering reparations. Though when it comes to Euro-American history on the grasslands, a good dose of that is warranted. Rather, I refer to one of the ancient meanings of the word, which is to return, as if from exile. The prairie is our home, a place from which so many of our fellow citizens remain exiled. It is time for all of us to return. That collective return to the prairies is ongoing and incomplete, but literature and words can play an important and positive role. I would not have found my way into that personal commitment without them. My own words and the words of others. They have carried me back again and again to the land of my origins. Words carry me still, as I hope they will continue to carry you as well, closer to the prairies and closer to home. Thank you